Dear Dr. Lisle, I'm in the process of marathoning the podcast, so forgive me if this has been addressed. I'm wondering about how the ego trap might apply to people who have not been given reason for high expectations. In a sense, whether there is some interaction between the ego trap and the Dunning-Kruger effect of lower capacity individuals being less likely to recognize their own limitations. The context which has prompted this is that I have a number of friends who come from difficult backgrounds. For example, a family history of mental illness or abuse, poor decision-making, relative poverty, and very little work experience. I found that they're generally unwilling to consider most basic employment options to alleviate their financial difficulties, figuring that they are, quote, better than, quote, most realistic jobs, and even enduring a great deal of debt to get dubious education credentials, which most anyone with a critical eye can see are not going to simply leapfrog them into a high-paying job, especially given the lack of work history. Can the ego trap exist for those who don't have much outside esteem coming in? Is it a form of deferral of failure? What say you, Dr. Lisle?
Interesting. This person's, circling around and looking for some correlations there and trying to make sense of a puzzle. So we can instead go right to the heart of this, and that is that we can see in their discussion of who these people are that we see some mediocre genes. Okay, so we're seeing some when they talk about mental illness and poverty and the person's background and poor decision making, et cetera, in the family. Well, what are we looking at? We're looking at some disagreeable low conscientious genes. And so disagreeable low conscientious genes would tend to feel like, they're too good to get their hands dirty and work at Starbucks or McDonald's or wherever it is that they need to dig themselves out of trouble. And they would also be suckers for get-rich-quick schemes of various kinds, quote, education that would supposedly put you in a position to leapfrog. And so this is, that's what you got. So it's really what you're watching is you're watching the genes of the parents now play out in the next generation. That doesn't mean that these people are bad people and they aren't worthy of being this person's friend. It just means that when you're staring at some decision making that is puzzling you, what you're really looking at there is you're looking at the I'm too good for this is not an ego trap. It's actually a disagreeable inference, bubbling out of that gene pool with a lower end or somewhat lower conscientiousness. And that combination essentially leads to what you and I would call entitled, okay? And so what we're really seeing is an entitlement process going on, and eventually they will, if they're an attractive female, they'll wind up married to somebody with some degree of means and agreeableness that is willing to take on their sinking ship. And if they are a male, they're going to wind up a good chance of bankruptcy somewhere in their future and some major humbling and basically an irritation and frustration about why, the city of gold has not approached them and put their name up in lights. So this is what's going on, and this is also dependent upon the age of the people. They're also being calibrated, and so disagreeable, low conscientious people are not in helpless circumstances. There's a beautiful thing out there in the world called reality, and they are capable oftentimes of learning through rather harsh experience that maybe they weren't quite as entitled as they thought they were. So that's actually what we're observing here is we're looking at the next iteration of the same genes that led to the previous generations' tribulations.
Fascinating. So, I just took one phrase from this question and assumed that it was about the Enlightenment trap, and that phrase was figuring that they are better than most realistic jobs. Can you help me understand where I went wrong with my distortion thinking?
Yeah, Enlightenment trap is actually a the notion that somehow we've transcended the need to compete, that we don't really care about outcomes. So this is the Buddhist that's sitting on a hill somewhere, hoping somebody's watching him or her while they beat a drum. And what they're pretending is that they're fully absorbed in the beating of the drum, and that they have really no other, or better yet, they're in the lotus position that they've carefully practiced, and they're in a silk robe. And
levitating,
they are
hopefully.
Right, levitating. If you look really carefully. Right. So what this is the Enlightenment trap is the attempt to sell oneself or others on the delusion that one has transcended the need to compete for esteem. And so that's what that is. So that's not what's going on here. So what's going on here is the person is feeling like they should be getting far better than what is being offered to them. And so they're susceptible to get rich quick schemes. They don't want to take the work that would help, etc. And so when we look at that, what we sniff instead, we also aren't looking at the ego trap. It isn't that they aren't willing to compete. They just feel like that they, in other words, they're not standing on the sideline and not trying. They're actually trying things, but they're trying things that are very likely to be ineffective. And so they might be applying for jobs that they can't get, or they're going to school that's going to theoretically land them in the riches, which it isn't going to, because it's this fancy program that came on late night cable, along with Tom Vu, telling them that they too could be rich. Okay, so yes, this is not the ego trap, and it's not the enlightenment trap. This is just straight entitlement. And so the genes that drive entitlement are disagreeable and low conscientiousness, and that's precisely what came out of their gene pool, and it's what's sitting inside of them. In this case, hopefully this next generation won't be as impoverished and abusive and cornered, possibly as a previous generation, as the world is now, literally twice as wealthy as it was when they were growing up. So the parents, were a little bit more cornered and frustrated and had less impulse control than perhaps the next generation will, because the circumstances are going to probably be quite a bit more benign. But that doesn't mean that the person won't sort of suffer some hardship and have to deal with some tough lessons. But this is just direct entitlement out of gene variation.
Fascinating. Okay, so would it be fair to say that in the enlightenment trap, people feel that they've transcended competition, whereas in the ego trap, they've been given higher expectations that they think that they can achieve, therefore the best move is to quit, essentially. So
right.
They're both not acting, but, go ahead.
Yeah, I would also just point out, the enlightenment trap is an option of non-compete. And so very often these things are... in other words, the ego trap can lead someone to the enlightenment trap. So an option from within the ego trap is to instead of just saying, hey, I'm choosing not to compete right now, so you can't judge me because I'm not trying, we go one step further if we're narcissistic enough, and we say, I'm not trying, but that's because I've transcended trying. I don't want to have a best-selling book. Okay, I don't want to achieve a degree. I'm beyond this. I'm just sitting on a mountainside beating a drum, and you can look and see that I have achieved some type of mysterious internal fulfillment that is beyond you. So it's a pose, and it's an ego trapped narcissistic pose that is got a dollop of delusion and acting over and above the ego trap itself.
It's fascinating because for a little bit, I think I found myself in this little enlightenment trap, because with the podcast, I was like, why do we need professional quality audio when Dr. Lisle is just speaking gems every week? And so...
Let's see. I'm not quite sure that's... I'd have to think about that. That's I think slightly slightly different. Yeah. Are we beyond the need to compete? Yeah, you might have. It might have been tickling some of those same circuits, interestingly
Right.
enough.
It wasn't a full-blown case because
Yes.
now we have better audio.
Right.
but
Right.
but
Exactly. Now it's like, hey, glad
yeah.
we got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, it's kind of interesting when you smell this, when you smell either the ego trap or the enlightenment version, that when you actually come at these folks with a possible value proposition or opportunity, watch them reach their hand right into the cookie jar trying to get it. Okay, so in other words, they feel like they can't get a decent job, so now they've shaved their head and become a Buddhist monk because they can't get a job. But then if you say, actually, you know what, I got a brother-in-law that has a firm, and people of your background, they pay them really well, and I believe that I could get you in there. Oh, really? Boom. The pretense goes away in 2 seconds, and so this tells us that the enlightenment trap is indeed a pose, and sometimes it's a pose someone can basically defend a lack of achievement indefinitely behind such a pose. It's an interesting way to live, but sometimes that's the most comfortable place for some people to live.
It's fascinating because in the Stone Age, or at least in a place that wasn't as modern and developed as this one, where you had to compete, there was no choice.
Yes.
These traps existed, but they were short, right? It wouldn't have lasted for 2, 3, 4, 10, 20 years, right?
No, they wouldn't last for more than a week. So the ego trap could not last very long at all, and neither could any enlightenment pose. That's not going to last either. So these are the fact that people can spend considerable amount of time in what is in fact a quietly distressing non-compete situation is a derivative of the modern environment, without a doubt.
Fascinating. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next question is the following. Dear Dr. Lisle, I run higher on the disagreeable scale, and as an aged 40-year-old man, I have a 2-year-old and another baby on the way. Being a dad is teaching me that I have to constantly fight my disagreeableness because I'm having to give more of myself to my kid and can't sustain trying to trade at 75-25 with him. My brain keeps telling me I'm getting a bad deal with my kid, but I know I signed up for this and need your help beating my genes. I know you don't have kids, but what tactics or advice do you have for someone to at least fake trading at less than 75-25 with a toddler?
Well, you're really not trading with the toddler. You're trading with your partner. So it's about the enormous time and energy that's going to go into child raising, particularly early. So that's who you're trading with. And I would say that in general, what you want to do as much as possible at those times is, and again, people's resources are enormously different from person to person, but that is not a time when you should be trying to save money. Okay, that's a time when you pay for whatever help you can get to reduce some of your burdens, so that you and your partner can get some time off. So if there's some a responsible neighbor kid that can give you an hour here and there for $12, you give it to him. Complete with cell phone numbers, and you don't even have to go far, but just get away. So one of the things that you want to do is to do what you can, and what your partner's willing to do in terms of outsourcing as much as possible. So that's one thing. So every device that's possible, diaper changing robots, things like that, whatever it is that you can do to reduce.
That sounds like a fun invention.
Yes. In terms of being organized and getting help with respect to food preparation in the household, getting a maid once a week if you can afford it, etc. Whatever it is that you can do to reduce life's burdens, because it's going to be hard sledding for a while, and that's the way it is. That's why the females are so inherently sensitive to try to figure out how much the male is into them before they go out a lot of sexual intimacy, because sexual intimacy resulted in kids, and kids resulted in this. Okay, and this means, whoa, what a tremendous workload. It's useful also maybe to know on the side that and probably is useful, is to know that your toddler and what your toddler is going through, they aren't having experiences imprinted on their brains. We don't have to worry about if we, number one, yell at them, or number two, let them squawk and be unhappy for a while and walk away. There's no damage being done. Okay, so there's a hyperreactivity to this that's due to the fact that squawking toddlers often meant predator or trouble or injury, I'm saying, that would be serious in the Stone Age. So as a result, we are naturally sensitive to the screeching noises that they make. It's amazing how much noise a 2-year-old can make, and that not only that they can, that they will. And whenever I've heard it, I'm reminded of that's an animal that was designed by nature to scream when they were threatened in order to get their parents' attention. It's not so great when they're right next to you on the plane, okay? And all their and they're under no threat whatsoever. All right, they just want something. They want some candy. So the point is that keep in mind that your lack of perfect performance and ability to withhold your temper and your et cetera, and the fact that you may not even like what you're doing very much, none of this is causing any damage whatsoever. So that's useful. That can take a little bit of pressure off that. And secondly, do what you can to reduce everybody's burdens with your checkbook, and that's what you're going to want to do during these early years where you're cornered and really overburdened in terms of time and energy expenditure. That's what I would tell you.
Fascinating. Well, I got a question about this, trauma being imprinted on the brain and whatnot.
Yeah.
So a friend of mine just sent me a video, I think it was yesterday night, and it's it's a video of a dad trying to feed his child some food, and the child is being doesn't want to eat it and not compliant.
Yeah.
So the dad pretends to feed the same food to the kid's stuffed animal. And it's a Mickey Mouse little stuffed animal. And he says, do you want some? And then he shakes the head of the Mickey Mouse just like the kid says, no, I don't want any. So then he takes the Mickey Mouse, puts it on the table, and then beats the hell out of the stuffed animal, and pounds it on the table with his fist. And then he right away takes a spoon of the food and gives it to his kid again. The kid just no complaints, just says right away, eats it. So it's I just wanted to know because, I saw this video, I looked it up on YouTube just to see the comments, just to see what people were saying. And there was 2 camps. First camp was, this is hilarious, no problem here, this is just funny. And the other camp was, oh my God, you traumatized the kid for life, etc.
Right.
So what was going on there, Dr. Lisle?
That's really an amazing video, and I'm surprised they got the effect. So how old was the child, do we think?
I think they were maybe 3 years old. They were eating, obviously, so maybe 2 or 3. Yeah. Got
it. No, I would say 3 because you need machinery, but it's interesting because a stuffed animal isn't too believable. So that's a very interesting window of development where somehow the kid seems to believe that the stuffed animal is somehow real. And also has the capacity for making the inference that through observational learning that they would somehow be punished. So I don't think that the child was making the same inference that all of us think that it's making. Okay? So we as adults look at that process, and we're inferring that we are inferring that this means the kid learns that if he doesn't eat the thing, he's going to get the hell beat out of him. I don't think that that's what's taking place there at all. I think that actually, to the extent that if this video is in fact authentic, which who knows, They might have had 15 takes before they got this. But to the extent that it's authentic, it's probably more the following. That it's probably more that the parent is displaying a bizarre instability, and therefore is problematic. And the kid is smart enough to realize, whoa, somebody's really upset. Okay? And so if they're going to make a request, I'm going to comply. Because you have machinery in there to know that if someone is really, really upset, that's not the time to try to get a concession out of them. So that's what I think is really happening. I don't think that there was an observational learning inference about this, and yet we as adults, we see it, and we could either be horrified or we could consider hilarious, one or the other. I'm in the hilarious camp. Okay.
Yeah, me too.
But I actually don't think what is happening is what we think is happening. That's what I believe.
Fascinating.
I think if you were to actually interview the child cleverly, and to try to see if they were thinking that they were going to be hit if they didn't eat, I don't think they were having that fear. I think their fear is that Dad was going to be all bent out of shape and upset, and they passed on that. They didn't want that to happen.
Fascinating. Yeah, so I guess with these YouTube videos, sometimes they go viral, and then you got other people uploading the same video but with their situation. So there was a lady who uploaded this video doing the same thing, and she beats the hell out of the teddy bear. The kid right away eats the food, and right as she feeds them the food, she starts laughing because she's like, it worked. And then, of course, this guy uploads the video. So just a fascinating thing. I'm going to post it in that Facebook group so we can all, argue about it. So yes.
Got it. Bizarre people.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Well, they
Fair
got their
enough.
likes and views, especially for me, that's for sure.
All right. What else we got?
All right. Our next question, dear Dr. Lisle, what kinds of adult things should generally be kept from kids, say 8 to 12 years old? Is there any harm in letting them have unfiltered access to the internet, for example, as long as we make sure they aren't getting into drugs or risk of pregnancy? In other words, to what age should children be kept fairly innocent, if at all, and why?
That's a really good question, and it's not one that I've really thought much about. What comes to mind for me is the notion that what modern digital media is it's supernormal stimuli, and so supernormal stimuli isn't necessarily a bad thing. So hearing blended voices with great music, I don't think that's doing anybody any harm. We're watching a movie that's a great story with great actors and actresses against beautiful scenery. I don't think that's a bad thing. However, you could argue from legitimately that watching hours and hours of television might not be the greatest life experience for kids. Now, I don't think it's damaging them in any way, but I do think it's essentially, you could see how they could get roped into it by virtue of the supernormal processing that's going on there. So Gilligan's Island is, entertaining. And what if we could have it over and over again without any advertisements? And we've got some 10-year-old watching it over and over, just hour after hour after hour of this thing. And what we might say is, okay, this isn't damaging, but I'm not so sure that this is really the optimal life experience. And this brain wasn't designed by nature to be, having this context of supernormal stimuli hit it. And I think it's better to shut the TV off and go play with your friends outside. I think that's a better life experience. And so I believe that's true. And so in that same way, I don't think it's a great life experience for some kid to be, staring at the opposite sexes or same sexes body parts naked on the internet when they're 9 years old, fascinated and then with all the supernormal stimuli and all the weird stuff and, et cetera. I just feel like, no, don't do that. Go outside, go play with your friends. I think that's a better life experience for them. And so that's what I believe. And so if I had children, I would actually insulate them from large doses of supernormal stimuli in that way. So there's been times when I haven't had a television in my house, and I have to tell you, those were excellent times where there was an interior quiet to the whole thing. And then when I wound up having kids live in my house, it comes back, and et cetera, and it's okay. It was never a disaster. But my opinion on this doesn't have to do. I do have an opinion. I don't think that any of it's damaging. I just think it's a less optimal path for a person's existence, and so that's what I would tell you. And I think that a 20-year-old has a lot going on, a lot of demands, and looking to be more. Has to compete in the real world in a number of ways, where an 8-year-old doesn't. And so I'm not so sure that, and also a 20-year-old, you're obviously not going to be able to have an influence over the 20-year-old supernormal environment in a way that you could an 8-year-old's. So I don't see any reason not to impose some reasonable restraint on those. I think it's in the kid's best interest in terms of their life experience. That's what I would do, but I wouldn't fret it if I felt like it was too much trouble and I just let him go. I don't think that your kid is going to wind up pregnant, drug addict, or a psychological deviant because they had access to a bunch of really adult level things and adult level materials that way earlier than would be reasonable for them to do so. That's not going to do them any damage, but it's sure as heck not going to do them any good. And I think that there's better places for their nervous systems to be directed at more ecologically appropriate stimuli, and therefore to have a life of an 8-year-old when they're an 8-year-old. I think that's a better way to go.
It's surprising how many opinions you have that my parents share, because they wouldn't let us watch TV at all. When we came home, it's like you either go do your homework or you go play. There's no right. TV and catching up. And it was funny because, like, in the playground, there was always a few kids that wouldn't let you in their social circle unless you knew certain TV shows, and that was like their little display for everybody. So it was always fascinating that my parents were like, "So what? You go be a kid."
Right. Good for them. Well done. All right. What else do we got?
Well, speaking of parents and children, our next question, Dear Dr. Lisle, my mother was or is working as a kindergarten teacher for about 40 years. And in her last year before retirement, she had, let's say, some issues with a particular child. Basically, the child was known to be extremely annoying most of the time. And on this one day, my mother snapped and slapped the kid's face, albeit softly. Of course, she told all of her colleagues and the mother of the child about the incident and got mixed responses. Her coworkers knew the kid's personality and were hence very understanding. Even the mother of the child told her not to worry about it too much. This all happened shortly before summer break, so they didn't see each other for a longer period of time. However, my mom could not take it that easy and sank into a deep depression. To make things worse, the mother of the kid changed her mind over the summer and proceeded to freeze my mom out of the kindergarten, which essentially she did achieve, since my mom herself couldn't live with the fact that she hit another woman's kid. Since the incident, she went to a psychologist and a psychiatrist who prescribed her antidepressants, since she was feeling almost suicidal over this accident and would have sudden outbursts of tears. My question now is, which underlying evolutionary mechanisms made her feel like this? Was the worst thing she could have ever done in her life? Or do you believe that other factors were influencing the severity of this case?
What's happening there is the obviously the guilt mechanism is going off. So the guilt mechanism has been designed by evolution to make sure that you don't get kicked out of the group. So if you do something bad and they catch you, or you're suspected, and your attitude is, no, I didn't, okay, then and you're signaling no guilt, it's a very risky gambit because if they're convinced that you are in fact guilty and you're not evidencing any indications that you feel guilty, then that's suggesting a deep level of low conscientious disagreeable, i.e. sociopathy. And that's likely to get you kicked out of the group. So most people don't do that. So if they did something kind of bad and then they tried to get away with it and they get confronted, they're going to have a huge amount of guilt or some commensurate, appropriate amount of guilt about it. They will show that in their presentation. And that presentation and the experience of the guilt is a protective mechanism for them to essentially throw themselves on the mercy of the group. The group can understand why it is that there was a conflict of interest between self and group. Everybody understands this. So and when you display the guilt behind whatever self-serving thing that you did, then the group says, okay, 5 lashes for you. In other words, some kind of a penalty of whatever severity seems appropriate. And then you have kind of paid your dues and you're back in the group, and the guilt was a critical element in selling you to the group that you are not in fact a disagreeable, low conscientious sociopath, because if you were, they would be very vulnerable. They can't turn their back on their little sack of nuts without worrying about whether you're going to steal it. Okay? And so this is why the guilt mechanism exists in people. It's a protective mechanism for group membership. Now, so your mom does this, quote, terrible thing. So she taps this kid on the cheek, apparently, that we can all recognize that if in 40 years of school teaching and 1,200 children through her tutelage, one of the 1,200 gets his cheek tapped, we know who that was. Okay, so such an incident arises, and this is of course no consequence at all in terms of this child. This child will be hit many times by many people for many deserved reasons. Okay, so this is no concern there. Now, your mom, however, has the mother has walked over a line, and as a result of that, she feels guilty. And so what does she do? She goes and reports it. Okay, hyper-conscientious nutcase that she is, she goes and does this, and then she judges the village feedback. And the village feedback isn't too bad, but then it turns out I'm a little confused about the mother of the child freezing the mom out of the kindergarten. That's a bizarre set of prose there that doesn't make any sense to me. The mom is the kindergarten teacher. The person's mother shouldn't be related to the school. I don't know how this transpires. Did they go to the principal? Did they lodge a complaint? Did they get the mom put on, some kind of probation status or leave of absence? Apparently something happened on an official basis, and the official people involved sided with the child over the teacher in some fashion, and whatever that fashion was, the mom's guilt displays were not enough to stop this thing from happening. So in some fashion, she got halfway kicked out of the village in some way. Now, so the question I think that the person's asking is, why does mom have this sort of acute self-flagellation process going on? And the reason is that because she's hyper-conscientious, she is attempting to send an extremely loud signal that says, sorry, never happen again, never happen again, never happen again, never happen again. That's what she's doing. And so and because she's hyper-conscientious, what as we've talked about, whenever you're at the extreme of the bell curve, you're operating under distortion. So if you are very open, you are underestimating the risks of that openness, and you are likely to wind up in trouble. If you are very closed, you are going to miss tremendous opportunities, and they could be the difference between life and death. You could be, you're not open enough to get out of Nazi Germany in time, even though you had the money and you had the awareness troubles. Okay, you just couldn't bear leaving your little neighborhood, and so, oops, your more wacky, less responsible, generally cousin, wound up in Switzerland, got out in time. So a lack of openness can be just as deadly as too much openness. Either one of them is a distortion, and therefore increasing your propensity to make errors, small and catastrophic. So in this case, the mother is a hyper-conscientious individual. We can tell that by her reaction to this whole thing. Suicidal ideation, for God's sakes. What suicidal ideations are is that they are advertisements to the village that we are testing our value to the village. Like, if I killed myself, what would you think then? Okay? And what that is that's a test to find out whether or not the gene pool makes an inference that we are better off with you or without you. So what we should have gotten, and she should have gotten out of that, was, "What are you kidding, Mom? Are you out of your mind? No, you're nowhere near being kicked out of the village. You're of course far more valuable to us than any transgression was a negative." Okay, so this is what's transpiring here out of this individual is the market test of her contribution to the village, and in order to and so what we're seeing is a vast overestimation of her concern that she has not displayed an appropriate enough amount of guilt to reassure the village that the risk factor to all their little, nasty sociopathic children, is minimal. Okay, so that's what's actually taking place here. So this is the kind of thing that you will see in various dimensions when people are operating on far ends of a bell curve somewhere, and they are therefore very, very error prone. So, I would say that the one extreme that reduces your error proneness is very high intelligence. So very high intelligence can mitigate mistakes all over the chessboard elsewhere. But otherwise, in any of the other domains, any extremity of personality away from the midline is opening up ourselves to error. And in this case, this is a rather severe, process that this poor lady goes through, through no fault of her own, just through her own genes, are driving a completely exaggerated response. Instead of whoever it is that she went to that wasn't able to help her, she could have used a consultation with Dr. Jen Hawk or maybe myself that would have been probably a lot more effective.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the story on that.
Fantastic. Yeah, and this listener follows up and says, since this whole incident, her mother has shifted to a nearby village, but still is unable to work since it flames up previous memories of the accident. So hyper-conscientious all over the place. Yeah,
hyper-conscientious keeps circling through, and probably, like I'm actually not joking about a legitimate consultation. In other words, someone who actually understands the machinery of the mind could walk her through some of the interesting inferences and explain some of the reactions that she's having in a broader evolutionary context if she's amenable to any kind of explanation like that. Some people aren't for various and sundry reasons. But it can be extremely useful to essentially have the internal audience understand the game way better than it does now. And so very often that can dampen down a lot of the circuits that are driving essentially a self-flagellation process in order to hyper-signal a village that we are in fact low risk. So that's what's transpiring, and ultimately this kind of crisis will answer to a decay function. In other words, she will reestablish her reputation in the new village. The new villagers will see what a fine person she is. She won't get kicked out of that village, even when they find out about this incident that she's likely to tell them about, sobbing or with a long face. They're not seeing the situation. They're not seeing the kid. They're not seeing any evidence of impulsiveness that would lead to a problem. So they continue to give accepting signals even as she tells them her sordid story, and they don't kick her out of the village. So ultimately, even when we have a distorted personality like a hyperconscientious individual, we will find that the crisis eventually mitigates, okay, and the responses attenuate over time. So that's how that works. Sometimes we can help it along with some wise counsel.